The morning in northern Burkina Faso begins in silence. Not peace, silence. A thin veil of dust hangs over the mud rooftops as the first light breaks across the savannah. Beneath a wooden doorway, a man bends down to tighten the straps of his worn sandals. In his other hand rests a homemade shotgun, its metal still darkened from the charcoal fire that shaped it. Behind him, a child watches, small fingers gripping the edge of the doorway, eyes following every movement. There are no words between them. In places like this, the unspoken carries more weight than language. Outside the village, faint footprints from the night before remain pressed into the sand, a quiet reminder that safety is something borrowed, never owned. Across more than 14,000 villages, this scene repeats itself. Not because these men were born soldiers, or because they sought glory, but because danger arrived faster than help could. When the state could no longer shield every frontier, ordinary citizens stepped forward to fill the space between survival and collapse. Stay with us. This is the story of people whose names may never enter history books, but whose courage shapes the fate of a nation. To understand why the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, the VDP, came into existence, we must return to a moment when Burkina Faso found itself stretched thinner than at any point in its modern history. Between 2018 and 2022, the map did not change on paper, yet the meaning of that map changed entirely. Regions once considered stable began to slip into uncertainty. Villages that had not seen conflict for generations suddenly found themselves at the edge of an invisible front line. In many areas, the people did not describe the crisis in political terms. They described it in practical ones. The soldiers cannot reach us in time. The road is too dangerous after sunset. We do not know who controls the night anymore. By 2019, the strain on the armed forces became impossible to ignore. A country of more than 14,000 villages had the military never designed to cover such vast and scattered terrain. Reinforcements could take hours to arrive, sometimes a full day. And in the Sahel, a day is not merely a delay. It is the difference between a home standing or burning, a family staying or fleeing, a community surviving or disappearing. As attacks escalated in 2019 and 2020, the question grew heavier with each passing month. How do you defend a nation when danger moves faster than the state? It was not a theoretical challenge. It was a lived one, felt by farmers herding cattle at dawn, traders crossing dusty tracks at noon, mothers putting children to sleep before dark, and village elders who remembered a time when the night did not belong to fear. By late 2019, pressure from communities grew impossible to ignore. Meetings took place not in conference halls but under neem trees and in village courtyards lit by kerosene lamps. Elders argued, youth debated, women insisted they could not live another season waiting for help that might not arrive. The message was clear: if the state cannot be everywhere, then the people themselves must fill the gap. In 2020, the government formalized the creation of the VDP, a civilian auxiliary force intended to serve as the first shield for communities most exposed to danger. It was not an army. It was not a militia. It was an act of necessity, born from a population refusing to watch their villages disappear one by one. Recruitment spread quickly, not because it was glamorous, but because it was unavoidable. Farmers left their fields for training grounds. Blacksmiths who forged plows now repaired improvised weapons. Teachers volunteered to defend the very classrooms where they once wrote equations in chalk. Shepherds who spent their lives following animal tracks now learned to read the tracks of approaching danger. What united them was not ideology, but geography. Danger was at their doorstep, and so they stepped forward. Training lasted only weeks. There was no luxury of time. While regular forces honed tactics and discipline, VDP members learned the essentials: how to hold a weapon, how to coordinate with soldiers, how to secure a village perimeter, how to warn neighbors before dawn. Their strength did not lie in sophistication. Their strength lay in proximity, in being present before the threat arrived. VDP members did not march in formation. They did not receive full gear. Many wore the same clothing they farmed in. Their insignia, if any, was a scarf, a band of fabric, or simply recognition by familiar eyes in the village. But the emotional burden they carried was heavier than any professional soldier's pack. When danger comes to your home, your decision to fight is not strategic. It is intimate. It is a choice between watching your village fall or standing in the gap yourself. Many VDP entered the program not with pride, but with the quiet, trembling certainty that if they did not, the next funeral in the village would bear a familiar name. By 2023, VDP units had become present in hundreds of localities. They were not perfect. They lacked resources. They lacked protection. They lacked the kind of institutional stability that armies take for granted. And yet, without them, vast regions would have been defenseless. The logic of their existence remained painfully simple. When the state cannot arrive in an hour, but danger can arrive in minutes, the only viable shield is the one already standing in the village. VDP were that shield, fragile, improvised, but indispensable. And so the question lingered over every village meeting and every dawn patrol. When citizens step forward to replace time itself, who protects the protectors? The formation of the VDP was not a headline. It was a moment lived in dust, in fear, and in the quiet determination of people who had run out of choices. If Task 1 explained why they emerged, Task 2 reveals how those ordinary citizens crossed the invisible threshold from villagers to defenders. It began in the courtyards of rural Burkina, where people arrived before sunrise, standing in lines that had never existed before. Not queues for water, not queues for grain, but queues to volunteer. There were young men who had never held a weapon, middle-aged fathers whose hands were calloused from farming, not fighting, older men who insisted they could stand watch even if their knees could no longer run. A few came with resolve, many came with fear, but all came because the alternative was unthinkable. A village elder described the first morning simply, "We were not strong, we were not ready, but we were alone. And alone, you make different decisions." VDP training camps were unlike any military facility. No paved parade grounds, no barracks, no formal insignia. Instruction began under trees, beside schoolhouses, near fields where sorghum still swayed in the wind. Trainers, often young soldiers, only a few years older than the volunteers, taught basic firing positions, how to recognize signs of an imminent attack, how to coordinate signals between villages. The training lasted 14 days. 14 days to prepare for a threat the professional armies struggle with after years. Volunteers learned how to shoot, how to warn neighbors, how to hold a line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But they also learned something far heavier, that once they returned home, they would become the first people an attacker sees. The first time VDP members faced real gunfire was nothing like training. The ground shook differently. The night echoed differently. The fear moved differently. In one village, the alarm was raised just after sunset. Volunteers sprinted to their positions, still unsure of how many attackers were coming. Some shouted warnings. Others lit torches, not to see, but to signal to their families that they were alive. It lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes that felt like an entire lifetime, compressed into a single heartbeat. When dawn came, some VDP stood with trembling hands. Some knelt in the dust, whispering prayers of gratitude. Others looked at the empty space where a friend had stood the day before. From that moment forward, they were no longer trainees. They were defenders, not because they had won, but because they had survived. Not everyone embraced the VDP with enthusiasm. Some officials questioned the wisdom of arming civilians. Others worried about accountability, oversight, and the long-term risks of relying on local defense groups. International observers expressed concerns about human rights. Urban elites doubted whether villagers could truly hold their ground. Analysts debated whether VDP would strengthen or weaken the state. But in the villages where danger arrived without warning, debates felt distant, almost irrelevant. A volunteer expressed it in words that carried the weight of an entire community. They discussed theories in places with electricity. We make decisions in places with graves. If the physical danger was enormous, the emotional cost was worse. VDP members often performed patrols at night and farming at dawn. Some lived with constant guilt for surviving when a comrade did not, guilt for leaving their children in the dark, guilt for not being fast enough or strong enough. Many had to dig graves for neighbors they could not protect. Many had to reassure families even when they themselves were breaking inside. This was not a glamorous sacrifice, it was a relentless one. In some villages, VDP were hailed as heroes. Families brought food. Children followed them with admiration. In others, fear lingered. People knew that volunteers became targets. A strong VDP presence meant the village could become a battlefield. Gratitude and terror coexisted, a dual reality that only frontier communities can understand. Once someone becomes VDP, life does not return to what it was before. They live in a constant state of anticipation, scanning horizons, reading the silence, memorizing escape routes. They know they stand in a position no one else can occupy. They are both shield and vulnerability, both hope and last resort. But standing between danger and the people they love comes with a price, and the deeper they walk into this role, the more the price begins to reveal itself. When the dust settles after a VDP skirmish, the world beyond the village often imagines a moment of calm, a fragile pause between violence and routine. But inside the communities that live this war, the aftermath is rarely calm. The true consequences of civilian defense forces do not unfold during the battle. They unfold in kitchens, in courtyards, in burial grounds, and in the quiet spaces where families reckon with what has been lost. For many VDP volunteers, the first battle is not the hardest one. The hardest one is the second, the moment they return home and realize that danger does not leave their bodies even after the shooting stops. Some cannot sleep without their weapons beside them. Some wake in the middle of the night at the sound of goats rustling in their pens. Some sit outside their homes long after sunset, staring at the tree line as if waiting for an unseen signal. Their children begin to adjust to a new normal. A father who no longer laughs as much, a brother who rarely eats with the family, an uncle who flinches when someone drops a metal bowl. These are not the scars recorded by reporters or analysts. These are the scars carried in silence, the kind that sink into the soul. Villages rely on VDP because they must. They grieve for VDP because they cannot afford not to. When a volunteer falls in battle, the community gathers under neem trees to mourn. Women prepare millet porridge. Men sit in circles, speaking softly, weighing the cost of a life lost in a fight that was never meant for civilian shoulders. Yet, even in grief, no village says, "Let us stop." They cannot. To stop would be to surrender the night. This is the paradox that defines the Sahel. The same force that protects villages also exposes them. And the same volunteers who guard the frontier become the reason hostile groups mark their villages as targets. Here lies the central tension of any civilian defense program. Does empowering ordinary citizens make the state stronger or reveal its weakness? In theory, the state gains more eyes on the ground, faster response networks, community intelligence that soldiers cannot gather alone. But in practice, the burden of defense shifts downward. Villagers become both citizens and security actors. Families become both communities and front lines. Leaders in Ouagadougou have tried to address this imbalance. Under Ibrahim Traoré, efforts were made to distribute equipment more widely, strengthen coordination with the armed forces, and place VDP units under clear local command. Support expanded, but the reality remained. No amount of policy can erase the fundamental truth that the first minutes of danger always belong to those who sleep closest to it. VDP members pay a price no salary can compensate. For every night they stand guard, there is a field that remains untended the next morning. For every time they chase shadows into the bush, there is a child who waits longer at home. For every moment they survive, there is a neighbor who must comfort a grieving family. The emotional economy of the Sahel is built on debt, the debt of survival. VDP repay it every day, often without thanks, often without rest. When hostile groups strike a village defended by VDP, they do not simply retreat. Sometimes they return with vengeance. They target leaders, destroy food stores, or attack at dawn when volunteers are exhausted from night patrols. Families live with the fear that the presence of defenders could invite retribution, and yet they cannot dismiss them. Without VDP, many villages would be abandoned entirely. This duality shapes every conversation in Sahel households. Do we stay and fight? Do we flee and survive? Do we risk retaliation or risk disappearance? There are no easy answers. Perhaps the deepest consequence lies in the role reversal between citizen and soldier. A VDP volunteer must sometimes choose whether to shoot, whether to warn, whether to flee, decisions that professional soldiers are trained to make but civilians never should be. Villagers who once argued about crop yields now argue about patrol routes. Men who once worried about rain now worry about ambush angles. Elders who once advised on marriages now advise on evacuation plans. War transforms not only landscapes but identities. And yet, even in the fatigue, something remarkable persists. Communities find unity in crisis. Families rebuild burnt homes. Women organize food networks for night patrols. Villagers create signal codes, banging pots, lighting fires, blowing horns to warn neighboring settlements. It is resilience born not from glory, but from necessity. And while the cost is profound, the determination is deeper still. But a force born from desperation cannot remain desperate forever. And soon the world will learn how this civilian shield begins to evolve into something far more organized. From a distance, the rise of civilian defense forces in the Sahel appears to many observers as a sign of improvisation, a temporary measure adopted by communities trapped between urgency and survival. But in the halls of regional and international institutions, the VDP phenomenon has sparked a deeper debate. What happens when ordinary citizens become the backbone of national security? The African Union's Peace and Security Council has flagged the proliferation of local defense groups as both a symptom and a warning. A symptom of insufficient state presence, a warning that decentralized force structures can blur lines of command. AU officials argue that while community defense may be necessary in the short term, it must eventually connect to structured national reforms. Without this link, the continent risks sliding into a patchwork of security ecosystems that vary from village to village. And yet, behind closed doors, AU analysts admit a truth rarely spoken publicly. Without local defenders, large swathes of the Sahel would already be empty. The West African bloc, already weakened by successive coups and political fractures, faces its own dilemma. On paper, ECOWAS opposes the militarization of civilians. In practice, ECOWAS cannot deny that many rural communities would be defenseless without citizen-led protection. Reports submitted to the bloc stress a fear that grows each year. If security collapses in the Sahel center, instability will not respect borders. It will spill into Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire, reshaping the entire region's political landscape. For European policymakers, the VDP question triggers two competing instincts. On one hand, human rights concerns loom large. Local defense forces, by nature, operate in environments where oversight is thin, documentation is scarce, and emotions run high. EU delegations warn of the long-term dangers, cycles of retribution, mistaken identity incidents, and the risk of parallel militaries. On the other hand, security experts privately acknowledge that without these civilian shields, migration pressures, extremist expansion, and humanitarian crises could escalate sharply. American analysts describe the VDP model as a test case, a real-time experiment in grassroots security. It challenges conventional doctrines that rely on centralized, well-equipped armies. It demonstrates that in remote regions, proximity and community trust often matter more than technology. A senior researcher summarized it starkly: you can train a soldier to protect a base, but you cannot train a soldier to know a village the way a villager does. As debates continue, one example repeatedly surfaces in international forums: Burkina Faso. Not as a model to replicate blindly, but as a country forced to innovate in conditions where traditional security frameworks cannot function fast enough. For observers, it offers questions rather than answers, questions that will shape how future conflicts in remote regions are understood. But while the world deliberates, the volunteers do not wait. Because danger does not pause for policy, and the next chapter of their struggle is already unfolding. For the VDP, the future is not a single road, but a crossroads. Three diverging paths shaped by pressure, exhaustion, strategy, and the quiet resilience of the communities they come from. What happens next will determine not only the fate of these volunteers, but the fate of every rural village that depends on them when the night grows heavy. In the best-case trajectory, the VDP evolved from a patchwork of local defenders into a semi-professional auxiliary force. This does not mean transforming farmers into full-time soldiers. It means giving those who stand on the front lines enough training, communication systems, and coordination to survive and to protect without being overwhelmed. Professionalization requires consistent training cycles, clear chains of command, embedded cooperation with regular forces, psychological support for those carrying unbearable burdens. Some villages have already seen early signs of this transition: VDP patrols mapping routes, coordinated alarms between settlements, and local commanders trained to read terrain, not just with intuition, but with strategy. But the cost of this path is time, something the Sahel rarely grants. This is the most realistic scenario in the near term. VDP remain the shield. The army remains the sword. Villagers defend their immediate home. Soldiers handle broader offensives. In this model, VDP do not become soldiers. They become guardians, custodians of their own perimeter, watchers of their own horizon, listeners of their own silence. This approach acknowledges a truth that no policy can erase. In rural Sahel, the first responder will always be the person sleeping closest to the danger. But this model carries risks. If VDP are relied upon too heavily, without sustained support, communities may feel abandoned. If they are not relied upon enough, villages may fall before help arrives. Balancing this is the hardest equation of the conflict. There is a third path, the darkest one. If volunteers grow too weary, if resources remain scarce, if morale breaks under the weight of repeated loss, the VDP could collapse under their own strain. A force born from necessity can also fade because of it. If that happens, the consequences would be immediate. Villages emptied overnight, displacement surges, frontiers widening into zones of abandonment. This scenario is not inevitable, but it is possible, and many communities fear it more than the attacks themselves. Whatever future emerges, one constant remains: the VDP exists because communities refuse to disappear. Their strength is not in their weapons, but in their presence, not in their training, but in their resolve, not in their numbers, but in their willingness to stand where no one else can. The future of the VDP will not be shaped in conferences or reports. It will be shaped at dusk, when a volunteer stands up, adjusts his scarf, and walks toward the edge of the village, because someone must. And before the sun rises again over the Sahel, they will step forward once more, carrying the weight of a duty no one chose, yet no one else can bear. In the vast and fragile landscape of the Sahel, the VDP stand as a reminder that history is not always shaped by grand strategies or powerful institutions. Sometimes it is shaped by the quiet determination of people whose names few will ever know. Farmers who stand guard at night, blacksmiths who put down their tools to pick up a rifle, and elders who refuse to abandon the soil that holds the memories of their ancestors. Their existence is not a symbol of strength or weakness alone, it is a symbol of survival. A testament to what communities do when the distance between danger and protection becomes measured not in kilometers, but in minutes. Across international forums, analysts speak of models, doctrines, reforms, but in the villages where fear and resilience share the same hearth, the conversation is far simpler. We stay because this is home. The evolution of civilian defense in Burkina Faso has become one of the most closely observed developments in the region, not because the world seeks to copy it, but because the world wants to understand how courage organizes itself when institutions cannot respond fast enough. In many discussions, people reference leadership choices, including those associated with Ibrahim Traoré, as examples of how a state can attempt to reconnect itself with the communities standing at the edge of insecurity. Yet even with national direction, the heartbeat of this struggle remains local. For the VDP, the path forward is uncertain. The risks are enormous, the sacrifices are heavy, but their presence reveals a truth impossible to ignore. When ordinary citizens decide that disappearance is not an option, they become stronger than the fear surrounding them. And so the question rises, not for officials, not for experts, but for history itself. Can courage born from necessity hold the line long enough for a stronger state to emerge? Or must communities carry this burden indefinitely? Wherever the answer lies, one thing is clear. The resolve seen in these villages is not temporary. It is a force shaped by memory, duty, and the belief that tomorrow must be protected, even when today feels impossible. And in that belief, many see echoes of what leaders like Ibrahim Traoré describe as dignity, the unyielding right of a people to defend their future. If you believe that the stories of ordinary people are also the stories that shape nations, stay with us. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and help carry these voices into the light.